Right. Well, my name's Joe Picarella, and most of you won't know me. There are one or two faces that I do recognise. But hopefully you know my work, because I produce cutaway illustrations for the aerospace industry. I started my career working for Flight International magazine, and I did 2 decades with them, and it was absolutely wonderful. Wonderful office, and used to laugh so much my sides would hurt when I went home every evening, and I'm sure you guys were all the same. It was an interesting job. Every 3 or 4 months I would have a new cutaway to do, and it would be totally different every single time, whether it was the F-22 or the Airbus A380 or a UAV or a business jet. I would go, I would visit the factory, I'd spend a week or 10 days there and collect engineering information, get briefings on all of the systems, and then take 1,000 photographs on the production line, and I'd come back to the editorial office and I'd spend 3 months or 4 months producing the cutaway for the magazine. Now, I did that, as I say, for 20 odd years and ended up running the cutaway department for about 12 of those years. But in 2012, I left Flight and I set up my own business, the Cutaway Company, and I provide the same service to the aerospace industry. Now, in my spare time, my interests are more historic. I'm a 24/7 aviation person, and since 1985 and onwards, I've been involved in restoring Japanese aircraft around the world. I started up at the Aerospace Museum at Cospet with the RAF Museum's collection of Japanese aircraft. And by the 90s, or the mid-90s, I was consulting on restorations all around the world. And I've surveyed and worked on probably around 24 Japanese airframes in that time. And everything from putting the right people in touch with the restoration teams, sourcing components, answering technical questions, or even restoring. I restored the cockpit of some of the RAF Museum's Japanese aircraft back to factory finish. And over the last 4 years, the bottom right corner there, I've been involved with the rebuild of the Oka flying bomb for the Imperial War Museum, and we've taken that back to its original complete finish as it left the factory, and now it's on display in their Imperial War Museum Lambeth facility. Now, if I'm not working on Japanese aircraft, which I do in my spare time all the time, I own and operate 1942 L4, which was built for the United States Army Air Force, and we support lots of D-Day events and organisations around the southwest, because I live in Devon. So we do educational events, or we turn up to commemorations for D-Day, and it's great fun, really. It's basic flying at its best, and my little old aeroplane there is, when was she built? 1942, so she's 80 years old this year. And in 2019, myself and my 12-year-old daughter, we flew across the Channel, the long way, 74 miles over water. And all you pilots out there know that an aeroplane engine changes its note as soon as it's over water. Absolutely true. I think nothing changes, it all changes up here, of course. And we flew back 74 miles, and it was a great event. But she finally went back to Normandy again, which was really fun. Now, the reason I'm here tonight is to talk about dedicated strategic reconnaissance aircraft, in particular high-speed strategic reconnaissance aircraft. Now, what do you guys think about when I say high-speed strategic reconnaissance aircraft? Now, most of you will probably think of the Blackbird up there at the top, the SR-71, and why not? It's a phenomenal aircraft. Everything about that aircraft was groundbreaking, and it still is today. That program goes all the way back to the late 1950s. If we go back a little bit further into the mid-50s, late 40s, we have the Republic F-12 Rainbow, in the top centre there. And go back a little bit further, we have the F-11, the Hughes F-11. Now, both of these are incredibly aerodynamically clean aircraft, and you have to be fast to do high-speed strategic reconnaissance. Go back a little bit further, and we're into the war years, and we have the Arado 234 Blitz. Originally, it was designed as a jet-powered reconnaissance aircraft, but it was hijacked by Mr. Hitler, and it became a Schnell bomber, so it never really fulfilled its reconnaissance role. Go back a little bit further, and we get to the F-6 Mustang, the reconnaissance version of the P-51. Back a little bit further, and we have the F-5 and the F-4 Lightnings. Again, both of these aircraft were fighters that were converted into reconnaissance aircraft because they were the fastest aircraft available. Now, the reason the Americans used fighters for reconnaissance aircraft is because we taught them everything they knew about high-speed strategic reconnaissance. Because we had built the PR Mosquito, and before that, we go all the way back to the granddaddy of PR reconnaissance aircraft of the Second World War. We have the PR Spitfire. Now, unfortunately, to quote a statement that's often accredited to Winston Churchill, but it's much older, history is written by the victors. In November 1939, when the PR Spitfire rolled out, the Japanese Imperial Army's Command Reconnaissance, or Headquarters Reconnaissance programs, because that's what they called strategic reconnaissance, had been running for more than 4 years. And aircraft had been operating in that role for more than 3 years. And 130 Ki-15s, as the aircraft was called, had been operating all the way up until the point that the first PR Spitfire appeared. Now, the Ki-15, it's a terrible name. We called it the Babs under the Allied code name system. So the Babs, as we'll call it from now on, had already been flying for 3 years before our PR Spitfire appeared. So the reason I'm here now is to sort of put the record straight, because for 80 years or so, people have said that the Royal Air Force developed strategic reconnaissance aircraft. But the history is a little bit different. Now, the material for this lecture, I've been working on it for the last 13 years, and I've got copies of my book down at the back there. I'm not expecting anybody to buy them, but if anybody is interested, be my guest. So let's move on to the lecture. Before we start talking about the Babs in particular, I sort of wanted to overview reconnaissance aircraft operations and the aircraft prior to the mid-30s so that we can set the scene. Between the wars, the majority of the industrial nations had suffered both the post-First World War depression and the Great Depression of the end of the 1920s, beginning of the 30s. Now, because of that, defence budgets were shrinking, armed forces were getting smaller, and nations travelled in different directions trying to defend themselves. In the United Kingdom and the United States, strategic bombing became the main aeronautical goal of their air forces. While in Germany, they concentrated on a brand new thing, blitzkrieg, to support their troops on the ground. But as aircraft grew ever more advanced, faster and larger, photographic reconnaissance was sidelined and slowly forgotten. And by the start of the 1930s, reconnaissance aircraft fell into two main categories: slow-flying observation aircraft, or slightly faster multi-purpose photographic reconnaissance aircraft. Now, slow-flying observation aircraft, like my L4, operate at around 1,000 to 3,000 feet, and they take sketches of gun emplacements and troop movements and pass that information that way, but they're slow flying. Now, photographic reconnaissance aircraft of the period were typically converted transport aircraft or slow lumbering bombers, which you hung a camera out of the side and took photographs. Sometimes there were multi-purpose aircraft that were toted as reconnaissance bombers, and these offered the capabilities of 2 or 3 aircraft for the price of one, which was very desirable at the time. Now, the United States had been quick to grasp the value of photo reconnaissance during the First World War, and within its very limited air campaign of 1918, it took 18,000 photographs of the front lines. But by the mid-30s, all of that had fallen by the wayside. Now, while the United States Army Air Corps would evaluate more than 40 different types of slow-moving observation aircraft between 1930 and 1940, it was very different for strategic reconnaissance. In fact, it was only in 1935 that the United States Army Air Corps made a fundamental decision that would put them back by 5 years. They decided, because they were focusing on strategic bombing, that their very same strategic bombers could do the reconnaissance missions. They could fly over to the target, get the photographs of the factories, come back, and then all the other boys would go over and then bomb the target. The only problem with that theory was that the United States Army Air Corps did not possess a strategic bomber at that time, and they would not possess a strategic bomber until 1939, when the B-17B was accepted into service. So it was a chicken and egg situation for them. In fact, only 15 reconnaissance or photographic F aircraft were accepted into the Army Air Corps between 1930 and 1940. And when I say 15 aircraft, I don't mean 15 aircraft types, I mean 15 physical airframes. Over that 10-year period, they operated 15 of these F-1s, which were modified Fairchild 71 transport aircraft. And they were all purchased in 1930 and 1931. They were quickly used for aerial mapping of the United States, and very soon, nobody wanted them anymore. And they were relegated to transport roles. So the Americans no longer had high-altitude photographic capabilities after that point. In fact, the next F aircraft to be adopted by the United States Army Air Corps was not until 1940. Now, in Germany, Heinkel tried to develop a high-speed strategic reconnaissance aircraft in the form of the Heinkel 119. That was an amazing aircraft. 2 Daimler-Benz 601 engines coupled together, buried inside the fuselage, with surface evaporation cooling system on the wings. As little drag as possible. But the Luftwaffe couldn't see the value in it. Instead, they changed their attention to ultra-high flying reconnaissance aircraft like the Junkers 86P2. That was a very slow diesel-powered aircraft. But it could operate above 42,000 feet. And it was immune to interception by anything the RAF had during the opening of the Second World War. In fact, it would be the summer of 1942 when a specially modified Spitfire was developed specifically to try and intercept these, that they finally reached those altitudes. But by that time, the Germans had stopped doing their reconnaissance missions. In China and the Soviet Union, there were practically no high-speed reconnaissance aircraft, and there were very few observation aircraft. Meanwhile, during 1938 and 39, in the United Kingdom, the strategic reconnaissance needs of this country were met by an unorthodox Australian genius, Sidney Cotton. Now, Sidney Cotton dashed around Europe in his modified Lockheed 12A, taking photographs for the Air Ministry. And he did that in secret. He modified the aircraft, put sliding doors on it, flew into parts of Germany and Italy, opened the sliding doors, took photographs, closed the sliding doors. Nobody knew anything about it. Now, these activities kept the Air Force and the Navy informed on German and Italian activities. And they were so successful that when the war started, Cotton was called up to help expand the RAF strategic reconnaissance capabilities of the country. But while Cotton was pushing the boundaries of what he could do, the RAF clung to the belief that its modern force of Lysanders and Fairy Battles and Bristol Blenheims could defend themselves on such reconnaissance missions. And during the Battle of France, they were decimated, purely because they were operating at medium altitudes, at medium speeds, and they were slower than all of the defending fighters. In August 1939, one of Cotton's reconnaissance pilots put forward a revolutionary idea. RAF flying officer Maurice Shorty Longbottom suggested the far-sighted and controversial concept of developing a small, high-speed reconnaissance aircraft capable of flying long distances into enemy airspace, solely protected by its high-speed performance. His idea was submitted in the form of what is a now famous Longbottom Memorandum, and it was grudgingly accepted by the RAF. And because of Longbottom and Cotton, for more than 80 years, the RAF has been credited with pioneering the concept of high-speed strategic reconnaissance activities. And the subsequent adoption of those very same activities by the United States Army Air Force in 1942, because we taught them how to do strategic reconnaissance, simply means that it's reinforced the belief that it was all developed here. Unfortunately, these events are predated by the Japanese. And if you're still clinging to the belief that the PR Spitfire was the first high-speed strategic reconnaissance aircraft, then think again. This is Mitsubishi's Ki-15 Dyna, a thorn in the side of the Allies all the way through the Second World War. This is the second generation of high-speed strategic reconnaissance aircraft that the Japanese Army developed. And it was the replacement for the aircraft we're going to talk about tonight. And this rolled out in November 1939, exactly the same time as the first prototypes of the Spitfire PR reconnaissance aircraft were being converted at Farnborough. So, how did the Japanese manage to develop and build the Ki-15, the Babs, some 4 years before more advanced Western companies and air forces? See, Japan had gone through exactly the same checkered history of reconnaissance aircraft operations. But faced with the vast expanse of China and Manchuria, they would build approximately 2,100 reconnaissance and observation aircraft between 1912 and 1935. And by 1935, the Japanese were entering a golden age for its aeronautical industry. Unbeknownst to the rest of the world, its aeronautical capabilities were beginning to match those of Great Britain, of the United States, and of Germany. And in some cases, they were surpassing them. And while Japan did play catch-up by importing foreign aircraft, studying them, or becoming involved with licensing deals, their manufacturers didn't stand still and simply copy Western designs as is always thought of with Japanese items. They learned from them and they improved on them. More importantly, the Japanese army decided that if it was going to stay an independent country and possibly expand, it needed to generate and produce all of its own aircraft in Japan. In February 1934, the Navy launched 7 new aircraft programs to help start the industry and get them to build advanced aircraft. And one of them was the 9-Shi single-seat fighter. And there she is, also known as the Ka-14 by Mitsubishi. Now the designer, Jiro Horikoshi, he laid the aircraft out in a very similar pattern to a previous aircraft, which was the 7-Shi, which we'll get to. But for the first time ever in Japan, the whole aircraft had flush riveting over the entire extremity of the aircraft. Now, when the Ka-14 flew in February 1935, it produced a top speed of 275 miles an hour. To put this into perspective, the fastest aircraft, the fastest fighter in Japanese army operation at that time was only capable of 242 miles per hour. Now, what's most important about this large increase in performance that was gained with the Ka-14 was just how it was done. They managed to take a 550 horsepower engine on this aircraft and outperform with a 950 horsepower engine, and it was all based on clean aerodynamics. And quite frankly, the Navy couldn't believe the speed that was reported by Mitsubishi. So they sent one of their chief pilots from the Naval Aeronautical establishment, Lieutenant Commander Kobayashi, to take it up for a fly and to disprove what Mitsubishi had said. And he came back and he said, "You're absolutely right, it's wrong. It didn't fly at 275, it's actually 279 miles an hour. So it's a very fine bird indeed." And now this aircraft in 1936 would become the A5M Claude, which was the first monoplane fighter to be adopted into naval service anywhere in the world. In fact, it would be another 3 years before the US Navy adopted the Brewster Buffalo into service in 1939. And the Brewster Buffalo was only 22 miles an hour faster than this after another 3 years of development. Now, Jiro Horikoshi, his drive towards the ultimate fighter would finish with the Mitsubishi A6M, the fabled Zero fighter. But all of the design processes and all of the lessons that were learned by Mitsubishi in the development programs that the Navy had instigated, all of those results were brought together in the archives at Mitsubishi, and they were freely available to all of the Mitsubishi engineering staff. They had the most advanced monoplane data in the world at that time. Now, during 1935, the two main characters in the story of the Babs first meet. Captain Fujita, he was with the Air Technical Research Institute, part of the Japanese Army, and Mitsubishi engineer Mr. Kuno. Now, Mr. Kuno was the head of, he was a chief designer at the airframe section of Mitsubishi, and he would later rise up to be the president of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in 1965, so he wasn't a lightweight. Now, Captain Fujita asked Mr. Kuno one simple question. They were looking at the Ka-14, and he said, do you think it would be possible to build a two-seat aircraft that could outperform the Ka-14 aircraft? And Mr. Kuno thought about it for a while, and he said, yes, it would be. But it would have to be exceptionally clean, and we'd have to specify the equipment fit right from the start. There wouldn't be any movement. Now, there's Captain Fujita, and he was heavily involved in development programs for the Japanese army. He helped develop high-speed strategic reconnaissance and ground attack aircraft designs. And unfortunately, he died while testing a Fiat BR-20 in China. And there's Mr. Kuno. He would go on, as I said, to develop several aircraft and end up being the president of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Now, we were talking about the Shi-7, which appeared before the Ka-14. That's the Shi-7. Now, Horikoshi famously described that as looking like a dim-witted duck. And he wasn't embarrassed by that. Aviation development moves very, very quickly. Now, that aircraft and the Ka-14 allowed Mr. Kuno to design what became the Ki-15. Initially, he started with the Shi-7, which was a slightly larger aircraft, and he removed all of the naval equipment, he put in all of the reconnaissance equipment, and slowly placed fuel around the aircraft, slowly developed it, slowly cleaned it, and we ended up with the Ki-15 there. Now, once they'd finished their original layouts for the aircraft, Captain Fujita decided that he now had to talk to the Army and actually officially get this project rolling. So, he called a meeting for July 1935, and at that meeting, he would have to not only sell the concept of a high-speed strategic reconnaissance aircraft to a very conservative group of Army officers, he would also have to sell his concept of high-speed strategic reconnaissance, flying unmolested over enemy territory. Now, without doubt, what can you say? His specifications were almost word for word exactly the same as the Longbottom memorandum for RAF strategic reconnaissance that would appear 4 years later. It's pure coincidence, as in all industries, especially the aerospace industry, ideas appear. But these ideas must have seemed futuristic to the panel of Army officers that Captain Fujita was talking to. Now, no Air Force on Earth was operating strategic reconnaissance missions anywhere. More importantly, they didn't have an aircraft that was even capable of doing these missions if they'd wanted to. But he managed to convince them. They weren't too happy about the fact that his aircraft was proposing to do it without any defensive armament whatsoever. It's the Army, for God's sake. We must put weapons on it somewhere. So they went away and they came back with a specification. Most importantly, it was their opinion that his figures for the aircraft were not credible when it came to the speed. And so, to avoid embarrassment on their part, not his, the Army stipulated that this prototype aircraft should only be as fast as the Navy's Ka-14 aircraft, which was outperforming the Army's aircraft left, right and centre. And this is the official specification that the Army put out. Now, you can see by the vague title that they didn't understand strategic reconnaissance. the experimental manufacture of a high-speed liaison aircraft for the collection and liaison of accurate intelligence under difficult situations. Basically, they were thinking about a liaison aircraft, somebody looking out of the window and taking sketches. They couldn't understand it. And they also specified an engine of 700 or 800 horsepower to actually perform these speeds that they were predicting. Now, it's interesting. Mitsubishi went back and did wind tunnel tests, and on their models, it led their design team to a very unexpected and surprising conclusion. By adopting a smaller engine on the aircraft, they could potentially still meet the performance and range requirements. And that engine was only 550 horsepower. With a larger engine, like the Mitsubishi B1 engine, that was liquid cooled, which meant a heavier airframe, more drag. The heavier the airframe got, the more fuel you needed to drag it along. The bigger the engine, the more fuel you needed, and so on. And it's a spiral. Now, if one factor above all would epitomise the development and ultimate success of the Ki-15 Babs, it would be aerodynamics. In addition to using flush rivets, Mr. Kuno buried the engine inside the fuselage and reduced the frontal area by about 25% by doing the delicate fairings around each of the engine cylinders. But that was a balancing act, because the more he covered the cylinders, he reduced the drag, but the engine got hotter and hotter. So they had to balance that very carefully. And the rocker covers on the cylinders were another problem. And they ended up testing almost 30 cowling designs before they came to this long chord town end cowling. Another problem they discovered during wind tunnel tests was that of the canopy. And the canopy caused a lot of drag on most aircraft, sticking up in the airstream. So they wanted to make the canopy as small as possible. In fact, on this aircraft, it was only 250 millimetres between the apex of the fuselage frame and the top of the canopy. More importantly, they developed a bifolding canopy system so that when the canopy closed, there were no steps like you would have with a sliding canopy. And what's more, if you can see on the engineering drawing there, they beveled the edge of the plexiglass panels of glass so that the window panes actually sat flush with the canopy frame. So there was not even a 2 millimetre step between the canopy frame and the glass within it. The Ki-15 prototype was completed in late April 1936. And it was flown by Fujita, and he said it was wonderful, apart from the low canopy. Now, the most important thing about the first flight was it recorded a top speed of 299 miles an hour. Now, these figures were nothing short of spectacular. It can't be overstated, really. Mitsubishi had not only designed their fastest aircraft, they designed the fastest aircraft in all of Japan. Now, to put that into an international perspective, the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, the FAI, airspeed record for land-based aircraft in 1935 was 345 miles an hour. And that was held by Howard Hughes in his H1 racer. And that had a 1,000 race-tuned engine and a limited fuel supply. And the aircraft, as you can see there, from the air races of 1936, was faster than all of the winners of the air races. But what was most important about 299 miles an hour was it was faster than any fighter aircraft in Asia and the Pacific. And when I say the Pacific, I include the Americans. Now, the Army were impressed with the top speed of the aircraft, and they probably, no doubt, spent as much time as they could reminding the Japanese Navy that they now had the fastest aircraft in Japan. But they misunderstood still the concept of strategic reconnaissance. For them, it was a fast observation aircraft. And what use is a fast observation aircraft if it doesn't have a defensive armament or an offensive armament like a fighter or a bomb load like a bomber? No additional prototypes were ordered in 1936, and that was problematic. And it reached the point where Mitsubishi were worried that the Army would not carry on and order the aircraft. But they were saved from an unexpected direction. As the winter approached in 1936, Mr. Kawachi, who was the Assistant General Manager for the Aviation Department at Asahi Press, which is the oldest and largest newspaper in Japan, asked for a meeting. During that meeting, he said to Mr. Kuno, "The world is getting darker every day, and we want to provide some good news for our readers. And because of that, we in the Aviation Department, we'd like to participate in the coronation of King George VI and raise the national pride of the Japanese people. And what's more, we're aware that you've been manufacturing 2 prototypes of a high-speed liaison aircraft for the Army, and we think that those aircraft would be ideal for this record attempt." Now here's the kicker. He then went on to say, "After all, it seems as though the Army are unsure how to proceed with this project." So that confirmed Mitsubishi's belief that the Army still didn't understand strategic reconnaissance. And he went on to say, "If you do the modifications we need, we'll handle all of the problems with the Army." Now, can you imagine a newspaper or a TV company going to Lockheed now and saying, "Can we have the prototype F-35? Because we just want to use it for a vanity project. Don't worry about it. I know it's secret. Don't worry about it." Now, Mr. Kuno realised that if he could keep the project going, there was a chance that the Army would keep interest in the aircraft. And so he agreed to the request from Asahi Press. And on New Year's Day 1937, Asahi Press announced their plan to fly from Tokyo to London and also set an international speed record in doing so. It launched a competition to name the aircraft, and this resulted in 536,507 responses, all postcards, and the outright winner with 12,854 votes was Kamikaze, or Divine Wind. On January the 20th, they also announced, after having named the aircraft, they also announced the crew of the Kamikaze aircraft, who was Masaki Inuma, who would be the pilot, and Kenji Tsukagoshi, who would be the navigator, both of whom were members of the Asahi Press Aviation Department. On April 6th, Kamikaze lifted off from Tachikawa Airfield at 2:12 in the morning and landed in Taipei, 2,230 kilometres further away. 7 hours in the air. After refuelling and performing an inspection, Kamikaze took off, headed for Hanoi, and then Vientiane, where the crew had scheduled their first rest stop. Early the next morning, they departed for Calcutta and then Jodhpur. At Jodhpur, they performed their fastest turnaround, 27 minutes on the ground, to fully refuel and check the aircraft. And then they carried on to Karachi with an average speed of around 200 miles an hour in there. This was their second rest stop. They left Karachi the next day and flew 2,000 kilometres to Basra before hopping over the desert to Baghdad and then on to Athens. This would be the crew's third rest spot of the trip. And while they arrived to little fanfare, the next morning there were large crowds of Greek onlookers because the international awareness of the flight had grown in intensity. They took off, they headed for Rome, then on to Le Bourget, and finally reached Croydon at 3:30 in the afternoon on April the 9th. And they were forced to shut down their engine on the taxiway because they were rushed by the crowds. Kamikaze had travelled unsupported. There were no spare engines, no mechanics on the ground on this whole trip. Unsupported. They travelled 15,357 kilometres, that's 9,543 miles, across 9 countries over 4 days. The whole flight had taken 94 hours, 17 minutes and 56 seconds, of which 51 hours, 19 minutes and 23 seconds had been in the air. Now began their charm offensive of the European capitals. On April the 16th, they took a goodwill message to Belgium and were introduced to the King. On April the 19th, they flew to Germany and they met Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, who was very impressed with the successful flight. And to commemorate the historic flight of 2 Japanese airmen in a Japanese aircraft, he presented both men with an autographed and personalised portrait of himself. How thoughtful. On April the 20th, the crew returned to France, where they were awarded the Légion d'Honneur. And on the 23rd, they flew to Rome, where they met the Prime Minister, who was concurrently the Minister for the Air Force, Benito Mussolini. He did not present them with a signed autographed portrait of himself. Some people are just poor hosts, I believe. On May the 5th, Asahi Press announced the flight schedule for the return flight to Japan. You see, unlike other international record flights, the crew of Kamikaze were not simply going to load the aircraft onto a ship and sail all the way home. Asahi Press and Mitsubishi wanted to cement their achievement. They wanted them to fly all the way back and prove how good the aircraft was. They also wanted them to bring back photographs of the coronation and details of this historic flight, which would beat their competitor newspapers. On May the 14th, Kamikaze departed Croydon from Japan and landed at Haneda Airport on May the 21st. The aircraft and the crew at that point became instant celebrities, the first real celebrities in Japan. Now, unfortunately, the aircraft was called back into military service that year, and on November 6th, it was badly damaged in a landing accident. It was beyond economic repair, really, but Mitsubishi and Asahi Press realised that this aircraft was very important for their image, so they rebuilt it back to flying condition. And it continued to fly until 1939, when it was damaged again. This time a crew member died and the aircraft was broken into several components, and it was at that point beyond economic repair. But they decided to rebuild it as a static at that point, and they put it in a special memorial hall, and it stayed there throughout the war. And Kamikaze survived the war, but under the terms of the occupation, any activities to do with aircraft were forbidden. So in the autumn of 1945, US troops dragged it onto the street and burnt it. And that was the end of Kamikaze. Now, unfortunately, he didn't survive the war. In July 1941, he'd been called up into the army, and he died in a taxiing accident in Singapore. Now, Mr. Tsukagoshi, very interesting. Asahi Press wanted to carry on doing flag-waving aviation events all around the world. And they started the A26 project. Now this was an ultra long-range aircraft, and it was planned to travel 15,000 kilometres, that's 9,320 miles, non-stop between Tokyo and New York. They built the aircraft, and then the Second World War started and the program was stopped. But in 1942, the Japanese army became interested in talking or having a direct link with Berlin. So they resurrected the program as the Ki-15. Now, the first prototype did some very long-range flights of 19 hours. And in July 1943, the second prototype departed Singapore, heading for Berlin, and it was going to stop at Sarabus Airport in the Crimean Peninsula. Unfortunately, Tsukugoshi, who was the navigator, was on board, and the aircraft was intercepted by RAF fighters over the Indian Ocean, and no one ever heard of it again. And we still don't know really what happened to the aircraft. So, operational service for the world's first strategic reconnaissance aircraft. In July 1937, the Second Sino-Japanese War erupted in Peking, and for the first time the Army were interested in strategic reconnaissance. And the first strategic reconnaissance flight occurred in July that year. And if contending with operational issues was not problem enough, the Japanese pilots had no maps of China. Nobody had maps of China. The reconnaissance crews typically flew out carrying station maps that were issued to passengers of the Manchurian Railway. Just small maps like this with a line and a few dots for the major cities. And that's what they used to find their targets. Now, in addition to photographic reconnaissance missions, they were tasked with identifying fighter defences that might be encountered on bombers' trips into China. Now, this was all normal for strategic reconnaissance flights, but the 18th Independent Company, they went above and beyond this. They started providing real-time information to the bombers in the air while they were on the way over the target. And that meant these command and control operations, or God's eye operations as we would call them today, allowed them to identify Chinese fighters that were coming in towards the bombers. They could inform the bombers, or they could vector their own fighters to intercept the Chinese. Now, as the 30s progressed, obviously fighters in China started to improve, the imported fighters from the rest of the world. And Mitsubishi realised that they had to upgrade their aircraft. So they put a larger engine on, which was a 900 horsepower radial, and added a drop tank and other features, including a slightly higher canopy. What was interesting is just how much detail Mitsubishi applied aerodynamically to the aircraft. If you look at the right-hand photograph, can you see the oil cooler underneath the engine? They didn't want an oil cooler because that created drag, and the one thing they couldn't have on this aircraft was drag. So they developed a very small oil cooler. But because of the tight-fitting cowl and the small oil cooler, the engine got very hot on the ground. Ideally, they would have made the oil cooler bigger or lowered it down into the airstream. They couldn't do that. So what they did is they cut out the leading edge of the oil cooler, as you can see. So the downward swirl of the propeller would push air into the oil cooler while it was on the ground. And that didn't affect the longitudinal flow of air when the aircraft was going at full speed. So they created a more efficient oil cooler that didn't affect the aerodynamics. And that's just how much detail they put into this aircraft. Now, which one was that? Now, this aircraft flew in 1938 and it upped to the top speed to about 317 miles an hour. Now, when the war with China started in 1937, the Japanese Navy found themselves involved in a war that was outside its natural scope of operations, a land war. Within the first couple of weeks, the Army and the Navy decided the responsibilities of each service. The Army would look after ground support and tactical support for its troops in northern China, and the Navy would be responsible for combating and destroying the Chinese Air Force in central and southern China. But doing that meant that they needed strategic reconnaissance aircraft, and they didn't possess any. The Army were helping them with their Ki-15s. And at that time, that wasn't really a problem. But when the Navy started doing 2,000-kilometre bombing missions into China, which were the longest bombing missions in the world at that time, they suddenly needed strategic reconnaissance aircraft to provide data for targets. So they developed their own aircraft, or started the development of their own aircraft. Didn't work. They didn't have the time. So they were put into the unusual situation for the Army, for the Navy, because the Army and the Navy hated each other, full stop. Rivals completely. They make the Royal Navy and the RAF, it's like a tea party compared to that. They were put into the unusual situation of having to buy Army aircraft and operate them in naval service. But it was a match made in heaven. In 1940, the Navy decided to commit an early production batch of Mitsubishi Zeros into action in China, the first operational deployment. Now, while these missions will be forever remembered as the first missions of the Zero, what's overlooked is the fact that they worked in support and had interaction with the Navy's C-5Ms, which is what the Navy called the aircraft, the C-5M. And it allowed them to work totally in tandem, because the C-5M could cruise along at exactly the same high speed as the Zero. Now, in combat, the C-5M crews noticed that on the first few bombing missions with Zero support, the Chinese didn't come up to intercept them. They'd already heard the rumours about the Japanese Navy's new aircraft. But the C-5M reconnaissance crews noticed that once the fighters and bombers had turned around and gone back home, the Chinese would send large flocks of fighters up over their cities to perform aerobatics and to show the locals and the population that there was a Chinese Air Force and boost morale, even though they weren't doing anything. Now, on the next mission, the bombers turned up with the Zero fighters, they bombed, and then they departed. And just as predicted, the Chinese sent up fighters after they departed. But what they didn't know was the C-5M was flying high above the city. And it was out of sight, they couldn't hear it. And it spotted the fighters, and at that point, it radioed the Zeros, which hadn't departed. They were simply orbiting 40 miles to the north, and called them back. And within 10 minutes, they had shot down, out of the 27 Chinese aircraft, they'd shot down 13 of them, and they were Polikarpov I-15s and I-16s, some of them monoplanes, and heavily damaged 11. And then, this was without loss for any Japanese fighters whatsoever, and at that point the myth, the invincibility of Mitsubishi Zero took hold, and it was purely with the support of the C-5M. Now the C-5M in Navy service was also upgraded, the bottom image there. They put the same Sakai 12 engine that was fitted to the Zero in it. And this was done for two reasons. Firstly, supply chains. They could provide, one engine for fighters and reconnaissance aircraft, one propeller. It was easier from that viewpoint. Now, the Mitsubishi engineers realised that despite the Zero and the C-5M being almost identical in size, there wouldn't be any great improvement in speed. In fact, it was only 12 miles an hour faster. So why go to the expense of developing and building a limited number, about 30 aircraft with these new expensive engines and propellers, and going through all of those testing programs? The reason was the fuel consumption of the Sakai engine. Now, on the Zero, at full power, it was using 345 litres of fuel an hour. That was with a 940 horsepower engine. But the Sakai 12 engine could be leaned back and back and back to the point they would sip 62 litres of fuel an hour. Now, that meant that the C5M, with its standard fuel load, could go on missions that exceeded 2,500 kilometres. It's not a very big aircraft. And with a drop tank, these missions could go potentially up to 3,250 kilometres. That's why they adopted this engine. And we're getting close to the end now. So, prior to the outbreak of the Second World War in the Pacific, the Babs was used on clandestine flights across French Indochina, Thailand, Burma. One or two RAF aircraft and spotters reported seeing unidentified aircraft high in the sky, but nobody could intercept it, especially not Blenheim fighters. No surprise there. On the outbreak of war, on December the 8th, which I should say December the 7th Hawaii time, but December the 8th in the Far East, Japanese military began their operations in the Pacific. And at the vanguard of all of these fighter and bomber operations, there were C5Ms and Ki-15s, the Babs, for the Army and the Navy. But for the Army, they were slowly replacing these with the Dyna, which we'll see in a moment, because the Babs was becoming obsolete at that point. It was involved in some important operations though. In Singapore, the Japanese were specifically looking for HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. Now they represented the biggest threat to the Japanese Navy in the region, and they'd been spotted in port. But a few hours later they were spotted out at sea by a Japanese submarine. The very next morning, a C5M spotted both battleships and called in a bomber strike. And at 2:50 on that day, both battleships, the pride of the Royal Navy, were sunk. The end of the battleship and the start of air power, really. In the operations that very same day, the Japanese Navy and the Army bombed the Philippines. And on those 2,000-kilometre missions, C5Ms did pre-bombing mission photographs. They escorted the bombers all the way there as navigation aircraft. They did command and control operations above, and then they assessed the damage and then escorted the bombers back. And once Java and Timor had been taken, the 3rd Naval Air Group began operations over Australia. In all, about 207 missions were carried out over Australia by the Japanese, and 58 of them were by the C5M or the Ki-15. In fact, the C5M was the very first aircraft to fly over Australia and take reconnaissance photographs before the Japanese attacked. But they ranged far and wide over the continent. On the 17th of June, a lone C5M Model 2 with the Sakai 12 engine headed deep into Cape York in Queensland, and it proceeded all the way down to Cairns. And then it returned back to Lae in Papua New Guinea, and that flight, its straight line distance, without taking into consideration operational detours, taking photographs or anything like that, was over 2,600 kilometres in length, which was the longest recorded operation of a Babs. But by the summer of 1942, the Babs was 7 years old, and it was being withdrawn from frontline service because Allied fighters were faster than it. With the arrival of aircraft such as the Spitfire and the P-40, and increasingly the use of radar, the writing was on the wall for reconnaissance aircraft, for lone reconnaissance aircraft, because with radar and with high-performance fighters, you could vector a fighter to sit and wait for a reconnaissance aircraft to just go along the route, and it couldn't get away from that. Times were changing for reconnaissance aircraft, but the Babs had served its purpose. The concept of a dedicated high-speed strategic reconnaissance aircraft had been vindicated, and Japan had done that. And what's more, the family line in the form of the Mitsubishi Ki-15, the Dyna, would continue, and another 1,700 of these aircraft would be built. And if you remember, the prototype of this rolled out the very same period that the very first Spitfires were being converted. And this is the second generation Japanese strategic reconnaissance aircraft. Now, very last bit, ladies and gentlemen, hold your breath. In all, 498 Babs were built for the Navy and for the Army between 1935 and 1941. But not a single example survives, or does it? This photograph was taken in 1974 by Charles Darby at Gasmata in New Britain. About a dozen Japanese aircraft wrecks had been towed out onto the runway as tourist attractions for holidaymakers who landed there and looked around the island, had a drink, and then took off again. If that aircraft still exists, and we do not know whether it does, that is the sole surviving Babs, the sole surviving very first strategic reconnaissance aircraft. That's the end of my lecture. I'd like to thank the Royal Aeronautical Society and you guys and ladies for turning up. If you've got any questions, please do so. I'm here.
Joe.